Hi, my name is Linda Forrand and welcome to Animal Adventures! We're here and going to explore Lincoln Woods Wildlife Sanctuary in Leominster, Massachusetts. Leominster is known as a plastic city and a manufacturing city. So who knew in the center of the city there's this wonderful place that you can go and explore nature with all sorts of plants, vernal pools, frogs. So come with me and let's see what we can see with Ron, our naturalist, as we explore Lincoln Woods Wildlife Sanctuary.
My name's Ron Lannon. I'm property manager for Lincoln Woods Mass Audubon Wildlife Sanctuary located in Leominster, Mass. It's about a 65-acre property, an urban sanctuary surrounded by houses, athletic fields, industrial areas, so it acts like an island to attract birds. So we'll get nesting birds in here, especially upper canopy birds that nest high in a tree, maybe some ground nesters. And it's also an island for migrating birds who are heading north. They see a wooded area amongst all these houses, a place where they can rest, safely have food, and then continue on their trip up north. The most important thing about this small sanctuary, though, is the vernal pools, breeding pools for spotted salamanders, for wood frogs, and then also for other, depending on how long the pools last, bullfrogs, green frogs, painted turtles, a lot of other amphibians. The sanctuary was established in 1965 by Elizabeth Lincoln, whose family was in the area since the late 1700s. This was part of the farm, part of the family farm. So this land always has been related to the Lincoln family, hence the name Lincoln Woods. We'll be taking a walk along probably a double loop through the sanctuary itself. It's sort of a long north-south sanctuary, and we'll come and visit the vernal pools in this area. And we'll be looking for other things along the way. We won't just talk about vernal pools, but we'll look at any plants. Right now it's the middle of May, so there might still be some plants here, but it's a very acidic area, so we don't expect to see anything different than you would see anywhere within 50 miles or so from the central part of Massachusetts. Very acidic, mostly oak woodland forests. And if you're ready, we'll start our walk right now. Right here at the entrance of the sanctuary, we actually have two flowers that almost have the same name. This plant here is called Solomon seal. As you can see, it has these bell-like flowers, green bell-like flowers hanging beneath the leaves. It's called Solomon seal because if you pulled up the root and where the stem of the last plant was, you'd see a scar that supposedly resembles the Ring of Solomon. Medicinally, this was used for various nervous disorders, and when these flowers are pollinated, you'll have pairs of bluish berries hanging down. Not edible. It's a member of the lily or the asparagus family that has changed a little bit now, and if you ever grew asparagus to a great height before picking it, you would also notice that it does have sort of bell-like flowers and does get berries. And right next to it here is its cousin, I guess is the best way to say, and it's just starting to go into flower right now. This is false Solomon seal. So it looks a little bit different. The flowers do not grow underneath the leaves. The leaves are larger have much more defined veins. And this flower isn't out yet, but the flower is a spray of white flowers at the end of the big leaf here. And this will get berries also, just like the Solomon seal, and they would be sort of a goldish looking berry. Okay, this is a very fine example of the Solomon seal. You can see clumps of bell-like flowers that when pollinated will turn into blueberries, hang below. Not edible berries. And it's called Solomon seal because if you dig out the root and look at the rhizome, actually it's called, it's an underground stem. If you dig it out, you'll see the scar from last year's plants and a few plants from the years before, and they'll form a scar that looks like what is called the Ring of Solomon. And the rhizome itself, you could age it actually based on how many scars it has on it. Visible scars, the plant's probably a lot older than that because the end part rots. So these plants can probably grow for a number of years. It's a wonderful plant. Come in about another 3 weeks or so, you'll probably start seeing the berries forming. Again, another flower that you'll see again mixed in with the Canada Mayflower and the Solomon seal. This is called starflower, certainly named for about 8-pointed star-like flowers. Usually they'll have 2 flowers, and you can see some young ones here. Probably not going to produce any. Here's one with a bud on it, so that'll produce some flowers. Again, common in acidic forests, where right now we're in the middle of a pine forest, so with all the pine needles here, this is very acidic, but good for certainly some plants. And as I said in the beginning, this habitat is throughout central Mass, and you will basically find almost in dry woodlands almost the same plants everywhere you go. So this, even though we're in the middle of Leominster, we'll find this in the northern Worcester County, southern Worcester County, some mountainous areas, but basically in oak and pine forests that are dry. Right now we're in a little pine knoll here. Well-drained area. It's above most of the other landscape around here, so it's well-drained. Great area for pine. You see the pines can grow fairly tall. We'll look at a much larger one right over there in a second. Here are some smaller ones here, and these are white pines. White pines grow naturally. They usually aren't the ones planted around reservoirs. Those could be red pines or Scotch pine, and they are called evergreens, although they do lose their needles every year, a few of them every year. And you can tell it's a white pine simply by pulling off a clump of leaves and counting the leaflets. So here you have 5 leaflets here, so you know that it's white pine. The other natural pines in the area would be red pine, which is the one that's planted in a lot of places, but in some areas in Massachusetts it does grow naturally, mostly further north. If you go down the Cape, you have pitch pine that has 3 needles, clumps of needles, and that will also grow in well-drained areas, but it's mostly the pine you have down the Cape. Pines usually indicate that the area was cleared at one time, usually old field succession, which means it comes back after the land was cleared for a number of years, or lumbered, or whatever. And this land might have been grazed at one time. It looks more like grazing land because of the undulations here. It's not flat, so it's probably grazing land at one time, either for cattle or for sheep. Pine was a very important tree. Look around us right here, you'll see a number of dead pines. There's 4 big ones here. The Could have been struck by lightning because there's 4 dead pines in one area. I don't see any fire scars, but lightning scars because of all the bark falling off. But what has happened, it has allowed more sunlight to come down to the forest floor and allows a chance for these small pines to start growing. Pines are not tolerant of shade. They need sun to grow. One reason when you look up at a live pine, you see all the branches are dead at the bottom because there's no use putting any effort or any energy into growing leaves on there because they don't get the sun. So white pines will mostly have all their leaves up towards the top if it's a forest-grown pine. Here's the pine cones themselves, and they will hang down from the pine. Various birds do eat the seeds. If you go up north, you have crossbills, which have specific bills that are twisted. They'll turn in and either get pine seeds or spruce seeds or whatever cone they're eating on. And these will fall off after the scales open up. The pine seeds will fall out, and then sooner or later, the cone will drop.
Can you identify from the pine cone itself what type of pine tree it is?
Sure. Again, if we look at our native pines, the white pine has a long cone. If we looked at a red pine, it would have a sort of blunt cone located fairly close to the tree branch itself. That would be the same with a pitch pine. We were talking about white pines before, and surprisingly, right near where the white pines are, we have a pitch pine growing. The white pines we have here have sort of rigid bark, small plates, but you can see this has deep fissures, almost a reddish look, and very large bark plates on it. If you look at and compare the needles, we saw that the white pine had the 5 needles in a clump, fairly narrow. The pitch pine has 3 needles in a clump, and they're not very fragile, pretty thick, pretty long. And then finally we get to the cones. You can compare the cones. Again, the long white pine cone hangs down, and this is the pitch pine cone. The interesting thing about this is this looks like it's been opened. It grows close to the branches. A lot of times it's covered with resin, and so pitch pine in a lot of places are dependent on fires in order to keep going, to keep growing, to open its cones, because they're usually covered with resin. A fire will actually melt the resin, and the cones itself will open, and the seeds will then spread over the ground. This is the pine that grows throughout the Cape. So if you're driving through the Cape Cod, the main pine you'll see in the woodlands will be pitch pine. Cape is sandy, glacial remnants. That's very similar to this sanctuary. This is a glacially formed sanctuary with a lot of sand and gravel. So very similar sort of soil. Pitch pine was actually harvested not for the lumber, but because it has so many resins in it, it was actually burned, and the melted resin was collected for what was called naval stores. So you'd get sort of a pine tar, you'd get resins that you would, the Navy or sailors would put on the ropes and various things on ship to protect that from rotting and from getting too wet. So it'd be sort of a protective material. In order for a pool to be certified, you can get a form from the state that tells you directions on what to do, and some of those directions include measurements, a photograph of the pool itself. You need at least, I believe, 5 egg cases within the pool of either spotted salamander or wood frog egg cases. You can actually also take a sound sampling of the wood frogs calling. And then you have to fill out various forms. Sometimes is it temporary, is it permanent? The location, so if you have a GPS, the location would help. And so it's an onerous sort of process to go through, but you're saving a vernal pond. These ponds are protected already. They're on a sanctuary protected land, but we could still certify these, and these probably are certified just because the state wants to know where there are breeding areas for spotted salamanders and wood frogs. Although we know these are breeding ponds, a lot of other creatures take advantage of these wetlands as long as they remain wet. So these are called facultative species. These are species that use these areas, but they don't come here to breed. They're here for a short time, and they don't really have to be here, but they take care of the water. They come to the water when it's available. So even sometimes here you'll have maybe mink or mammals of some kind going through here, wood ducks, there are some mallards in here, and sometimes you have to look very closely into the water to see what you find. You also will find bullfrogs and pickerel frogs and green frogs, sometimes painted turtles, and a lot of invertebrate, a lot of water insects. One of these insects, I have a whole handful of them here, these are caddisfly larvae. You can see one right there with its head out. I think you might be able to see that. Mm-hmm. And they take the debris from the bottom of these ponds and make, using silk, sew them together and make protective casings for them. And these will then turn into mayflies, caddisflies, I'm sorry, that you'll see flying around. There's usually hatches of different sorts in different ponds at different times of year. These hatches are what fly fishermen use to figure out what the bait for the trout or whatever fish they're fishing for will be, because when you have a hatch you want to try to resemble the caddisfly, in some cases mayflies, that also come out of the water. So you can see these things are moving. That's just the larvae just getting out of, just moving around here. There's a whole bunch of different caddisflies, so if you have a stream caddisfly, what they would actually do is make their cases out of pebbles. Sometimes they'll make, depending on the species, the structure of this will be different, where the leaves will be set up vertically instead of horizontally and piled up on each other. The other thing I have here are these tiny little clams. I call these finger clams. There might be a better word for them, that you'll also find in these pools. But this isn't an indicator species like the spotted salamander or the wood frog. So we've gone part way down this complex of vernal pools. It seems like there's no eggs in these shallow areas, so we'll go to the deepest pond, see if there's any eggs in there. That might be the most successful area, and that might be where all the spotted salamanders are tuned into, or the most successful spotted salamanders. I'll put these back in the water where they belong. And caddisflies, you'll see come to, if you have a light on at night, they have fairly long antennae and will have folded wings. They look a little bit moth-like, but their wings sort of form a roof over their body. And again, they can be all different colors, all different types. There's even some that you might see during the winter. We're at the most southern pool of the vernal pool complex, the deepest pool, and this seems to be the only place where we've seen any eggs. And I have a couple egg masses here attached to a stem. You see one coming out of the water right here.
Oh, perfect.
And this is a spotted salamander egg case. And you can see it's starting. You can see the little creatures starting to form in there. And you say, well, how do you know it's a spotted egg case as opposed to a wood frog egg case? Well, this is more gelatinous. A wood frog egg case, if you pick up, would sort of ooze through your hands and would have thousands, up to thousands of eggs in the case. This has probably, 70 maybe, which might be actually a mixture of two egg cases together. And these are usually attached to branches in the pond, and these haven't hatched yet. This is deep water, so I'm pretty confident that these will make it to larva and then to young adults and come onto the shore and go up into the woods, where they will then spend a lot of their time underground. You don't usually find spotted salamanders unless, if you could be lucky, but most of the time you'll just see them when they're migrating to these pools. Now, salamanders won't lay many eggs, maybe 25 to 30 eggs, but they live to be about 20 years. So even if they have a really 1 or 2 successful years, that'll be pretty good for them. Wood frogs can lay thousands of eggs, 1,000 or so, and they lay many more eggs because the eggs aren't as successful. And sometimes you'll find these egg cases and they'll be pure white. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with them. It's just they're pure white. And right now you can see it's started to turn greenish, so it's starting to get algae on it, which is a symbiotic relationship. It's a place for algae to grow, but algae provides oxygen too. So if these turn green, that's not a big deal. They don't remain clear when they're first laid. Now, the important thing about these ponds, which I haven't mentioned, is that in order for these egg cases to survive, this has to be a place that has no fish in it. And there are no fish in here because the fish would eat the eggs. Now, maybe a few other things, of course, will predate on the young tadpoles or on the young larvae. There could be large water beetles that will eat them, and some other creatures that live, water scorpions, other creatures that live in the water that will eat the tadpoles. But the eggs are pretty much okay as long as there's no large fish that can eat the eggs. So being a pond that doesn't hold water, that sort of reduces the whole fish issue of feeding.
So how long does it take from the eggs to get to the larvae?
From the eggs to the larvae, well, we're talking with variables here, temperature of water, everything when the eggs were laid. But I would say eggs to adults would take about 3 months. Eggs to larva, probably half of that.
And they have to do in that time-wise because the vernal pool can dry up.
The vernal pool can dry up. Again, for most years, having worked here for a number of times, this one pretty much holds, but it will get shallower. Shoreline will go away. Other vernal pools that I've seen in other places that have a lot of tadpoles are sometimes so dry that you know that nothing is going to live for that year, but maybe in a really rainy year it's able to support the larvae and the tadpoles. Here's something you'll find in early or mid-spring, again, middle of May, are tent caterpillars. These nests are almost solar collectors, so they can keep the caterpillars warm. They all go back into here at night in cold weather, and this will hold heat, keep them warm. All these spots you see throughout this web, that's called frass. That's sort of the name for insect droppings in general are called frass. And if you remember the gypsy moth invasion last year, there was you could sometimes walk through the woods, and if there were a lot of gypsy moths in there, you'd be hearing the frass coming down out of the trees. These are hairy caterpillars. Hairy caterpillars are mainly fed on by cuckoos. They'll feed on gypsy moths, they'll feed on tent caterpillars, and you would think that after eating something very hairy, what happens to all the hairs? Well, the cuckoo has the ability to shed its stomach lining with all those hairs and regrow a new stomach lining so they can eat hairy caterpillars. So usually if there's a very large population of gypsy moths, we'll also end up getting a lot of cuckoos, which usually we don't see very often. You might hear them, but you don't see them very often. But during outbreaks of gypsy moths especially is when you'll hear and see them more often. You can read the landscape here also of past uses by looking at certain things. We saw white pines behind us here. There's a whole bunch of white pines on the level area, old field. We have rock walls going through the area, so we know that there were fields for pasturing. And the other thing you look for is a tree that is much larger than the surrounding trees. It looks out of place. Indications of a lot of lower branches, which means that it was growing in an open area. So what we have is generally what these trees are called. And you can find them in a lot of forests. They're just trees that are much larger, had lower branches at one time, and they're generally called wolf trees. They're called wolf trees because they sort of, this is a forester's term, they sort of suck in all the energy from the other trees. They shade out other trees from growing out around them, which they don't really, but it's just a term. This is a white oak. These trees can live for a very long time. One of the largest trees in Massachusetts at one time was a white oak with a 23-foot circumference. And white oak has lobed leaves. You can see if we could find a white oak here. It has lobed leaves, so they're not pointed. They're not pointed like the red or black oaks. And they're lobes. All the members of the white oak family have leaves that are lobed. Here's a leaf from last year. You can see that it has a lobed leaf. Very important wood if for making barrel staves. So you hear of oak barrels. The type of oak that's used is white oak because white oak wood cells line up in a way that the barrels won't leak. So white oak was used for holding fluids, and it ages the fluids well. If you made barrels from red or black oak, the wood cells on those leak. So those oaks were used to make barrels for dry materials, flour, cranberry, nails, a lot of other things. So there's different ways of how humans use oak.
Had such a wonderful time exploring Lincoln Woods Wildlife Sanctuary with Ron. There's such wonderful vernal pools and woods right in the middle of Leominster, and it's fun to explore. So till next time, have your own animal adventures, and take care everyone, and thank you for watching.